Hello and welcome. This is Mouse Gunner, and we're back with some more Automation the Car Company Tycoon game. Continuing on with the campaign roleplay of the Edison Car Company in 1986. And what I plan on doing with this video is bringing out a brand new model for the Edison lineup. And that is going to be something that's quite popular at this point in time, and that's an economical sports car. We have examples of that in the Toyota MR2 and the Pontiac Fiero from this time period. And I mentioned both of those because they're both mid-engine cars, which is something that we're also going to be building as a mid-engine economical sports car, and that's at least the idea. Now, with both of those cars, you have a base engine and you have a higher performance engine. You have, for instance, in the Fiero, you have an inline-4 as your base engine, and then you have a V6 as your higher output engine. For the Toyota MR2, you have an inline-4 that's naturally aspirated, and then an inline-4 that's supercharged, at least at this time period, this generation of Toyota MR2, for your higher output version. Now, we don't have supercharging in the game at the moment, but we do have turbocharging, and that's what I plan on doing. So, as far as what engines I want to use, I'm going to use the LE86 engine and turbocharge that up as our high output version. Now, for our base engine, I'm actually torn on this. I've been kind of going back and forth on whether I want the LE86 engine naturally aspirated as our base engine, or the L135 engine, the 2.2 liter variant, as our naturally aspirated base engine. Now, the reason I would have for either choice is, for one, with the 1.6 liter engine naturally aspirated, I'm not so sure if it will give us the power output I'm looking for. Now, it will be lighter and less expensive. As we can see here, because the 2.2 liter engine is not only a larger displacement engine, it is also an aluminum block engine. It is a lot more expensive and it takes a lot more time to build. But the benefit of that is that it will be a lot less difficult to get that higher performance, that higher power output that I'm looking for from the naturally aspirated engine. Now, obviously, I want the turbocharged engine to be more powerful than the naturally aspirated engine, but I think the route I'm going to go is with the 2.2 liter engine. It is going to be a little bit more expensive because of that aluminum block, but the aluminum block will aid us in lowering its weight, which is a good thing and what we're kind of looking for with this build. So let's go ahead and start off with the base engine. We're going to go ahead and make a revision of the 2.2 liter engine. And let's go ahead and make sure we clone that so I don't make that mistake that I usually make, which is start building an engine and then realize, oh, I'm changing the original engine, not making a variant at all. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is I want to keep it at that 2.2 liter displacement. But I do want to get this thing to be higher output than it is. So I don't think, though, on the other hand, it's a good idea for me to change the fuel quality, because the whole idea about this is that it's supposed to be the economical sports car. And if you use that comparison of, Toyota MR2s and Pontiac Fieros, what are they going to be using? They're going to be using regular fuel. So I can't really use that to gain out in power. But I definitely want this to be higher output than the base engine is. So we do have to consider that. And I also don't think it would be a good idea to change what my crank and pistons and things like that are either. So, because we're trying to keep things economical yet again. I definitely think that we could probably change the muffler down to just one reverse flow muffler. I mean, it makes it louder, but you kind of want that with the sports car. So that's perfectly fine for me. And I don't know, did that give us more power output? It didn't really, but it's going to lower weight and cost. So that's good as well. So now that we have that done, what else can we do with the performance? Well, obviously we can get this thing to be a little bit higher revving than it is, but we do have to consider the parts and how well they're going to handle that. So first things first, let's go ahead and increase our RPM limit, as that is not all that high, obviously. What is our compression ratio at too? It would be nice if we could improve that, but I don't think we will be. But let's get our RPM limit up here. And this is going to make our reliability kind of plummet here. And that is something to kind of consider. And I don't think I want to push it beyond 6,200. Now, right now, 6,100 is the peak. But it may change as we change dynamics of things. But let's go ahead and kind of play with this stuff. So let's go with cam profile here. And we're going to make it a little bit more aggressive. And so far, I'm not really noticing a difference at the RPM. So I honestly, that might be all we do is change that cam profile. As a matter of fact, I'm not exactly sure why we had the cam profile set up the way it was in the original engine. Because we're getting a lot more power out of this thing. And probably at this point, we're going to start knocking. Yes. So right with there, we were able to up it to 95 horsepower. Now, that's not really fantastic. I would like to get it probably above 100, but I honestly not sure if I can. But one area I might change here is the fuel mixture to try and get that up. Now, that is going to make our fuel economy kind of plummet here, but it might be a good change for us. And let's change the ignition timing to match here. So I think we can get pretty close to 100. Just with this change. We'll be knocking at that point. It might be worth changing our fuel mixture up one more point, which gives us power in and of itself. Then our ignition timing. And this is also changing where our red line comes in. Okay, we've got it up, and that's probably where our peak is, as a matter of fact. And we got it up at exactly 100 horsepower, which is what I was looking for, which is good. Now, our fuel economy is going to suffer as a result of all that, but and as a matter of fact, our peak power might be different as well. So let's figure that out. Looks like it's still at 6,000. Oh, well, it actually changes to 6,200. I might stay with the 6,100 or even go up to 6,000. Main reason being is I want to get that reliability back up. And 5,900. Okay, yeah, so 6,000. That actually looks pretty good. I'm pretty happy with that. We got our power up to where I was kind of looking for. In the future, like if I were to jump this up to 91, I would definitely look for more power than this. Like if you were to use an example of an MR2 from the early 90s, I think the MR2 with its base engine, at least the American version, which would also be 2.2 liters like this, I think it went as high as 130, somewhere around there, 130, 135 for power. And I'm going to say that's, the only number I know for sure is the 93 MR2 is going to get you that kind of power. So that's kind of a lot to ask in the next time period, and I honestly don't know if this power output is all that great, but you also have to consider that that MR2 from that period is going to have a combination of things. It's going to have, one thing we can do that I didn't even consider is we can up this to a 4-barrel carb and actually play with things here. Maybe drop down our fuel mixture here, and as a result, we get the economy, but we get the power as well. That looks like, but where that power comes in is just changed quite a bit. All right, so we're going to have to, that looks like where our peak is right here. Yeah, so we have the 100 horsepower we're looking for, but it comes a little bit later. But that's okay. By doing what we just did, we're going to really improve fuel economy. So what I think we're going to do is we're going to improve that RPM limit. We'll put it at 6,100. I don't want to go much beyond that. It obviously drops the reliability down to do that. But now that I think about it, that's probably the way we want to go. So we're going to call this the 2.2, and we're going to call this, I'll call it HP for high, or HO for high output. There we go. All right, so that's the engine. I think I'm happy with that. All right, so let's go ahead and save that on up. Okay, so you might have noticed the edit here, and that's because due to my inexperience with turbocharged engines, I kind of had to work with this engine a little bit more off camera to kind of figure out what I needed to do. And as a result of that, I was able to get more what I wanted out of things. And, you don't have to sit there and watch me struggle through the process. So I'll go ahead and show you what I did. So we just saw the 2.2 high output version. Let's go ahead and see what I did for the turbocharged version here. So let's pop into it. Okay, so starting off from the top, I ended up upgrading this engine with forged crank, I-beam steel conrods, and forged pistons. And a lot of that is due to I did to make this engine a lot more durable because I wanted to get this thing really high revving, as well as, switching to forged pistons gives you a little bit of extra fuel octane, which I need a little bit of every bit of fuel octane I could get. Let's put it that way. Now, the compression ratio went down a bit from the 1.6 liter engine, which I believe it was at like 7.7, somewhere around there, and that did lower. And you're going to probably see that dynamic whenever you switch to a turbocharged engine. You're going to have to lower down that compression ratio quite a bit. Now, I could have lowered it more than I did, honestly, but I'm pretty happy with the numbers we ended up with. Now, with the cam profile, as I said, I went really aggressive with this. So we're pretty high here for a normal, again, economy sports car here. So that's pretty much that. As far as the turbocharger, now this is the real part. I went with, most of these are pretty much, standard. I actually don't know if I know the difference between journal bearing and ball bearing, but I'm going to go with this as it's probably the more standard setup. But I ended up initially trying to design this thing without an intercooler. That didn't go very well. Designing an engine without an intercooler doesn't go so well when you're working with a turbocharger, which is interesting considering how I think a lot of engines at this period of time didn't really have intercoolers. I don't really know the history of intercoolers, I will admit. My knowledge of turbochargers, if I haven't already said it, is limited comparatively to a lot of the other things I know about engines and cars and everything. So you'll have to forgive me if I'm not 100% on that. But I want to say that in the 80s, initially there was some water injection in the exhaust to cool initially, or maybe not in the exhaust, in the turbocharger system somewhere. And if I remember correctly, Saab did that early on with some of their turbocharged cars. And I don't know exactly when intercoolers started happening. So I don't know if this is period correct or not. So you forgive me if it isn't. I was also worried on whether or not the engine would fit. But as a result of trying to design this thing without an intercooler and just how awful that went, I ended up going with the best intercooler I could get, which is a water-to-air medium-sized intercooler. And there are a couple different reasons why I chose that route. First off, it makes the cost and production unit time a lot higher. And I wanted to make this engine more expensive than the base engine because that theoretically makes sense, right? Without the intercooler and everything like that, this engine was actually pretty significantly cheaper and requiring less production unit time than the base engine. And that didn't, to me, sit well. So that's the reason why I went that route. Now, my compressor setup, again, I'm kind of an amateur at this, but I went with what seemed to work. So I set up my compressor at 42 millimeters, and then the compressor is essentially the overall size of the unit. Turbine, I set it up at 40.5 millimeters. Now, the turbine is the size of the blades of the turbine. And essentially, by changing this, you're changing the dynamics of how quickly that turbine spins up, but also what kind of overall power it can give you or torque it can transmit into compressing that air. So essentially, the way it works is the smaller the turbine is, the quicker it will spool up. It takes less to get it to move. It's less mass. But in the end, it also gives you less overall power, or less, it doesn't force that air with the same amount of force. It essentially has an upper limit of how fast it can spin, right? So having a larger turbine eventually will give you, more power, but it takes you longer to spool up, obviously. So there's a delay that power takes. Now, the AR ratio is essentially the diameter that the inlet of air is from that turbine. So essentially, the way you would want to think about this is it's just like a hose. So if you were to put your thumb over a hose and kind of restrict its flow, it makes that water come through with a lot more power and pressure, but it also limits how much overall air can get through. So if you were to take your thumb off, obviously the water's going to come through. More water is going to come through, but it maybe not coming through with as much power. So that's kind of how that works. But you also have to consider that as you get more airflow, as your turbine's bigger and it's pushing through more air, that air flow restriction is going to have a limit as well. So just like, the size of your turbine is going to limit how much you can get going, the AR ratio is also going to limit that number as well. And then your max boost is essentially how much boost you're pushing through, and that's in PSI, pressure units. So, and obviously you could put this in metric system if you wanted to, but I don't understand the metric system because I'm an American. So I'm getting in a little over 11 PSI. And any excess boost that I would be getting is going to be blown off by the wastegate. So that's essentially what I've done is I've set up the wastegate so any more PSI than this is going to get be leaked out or not enter the system and not going to enter the engine. So there you go. And this is as far as I can see where you get a lot of your power. But as you increase the boost, you also have a lot of other effects. It really hurts your reliability. And this engine's not going to be all that reliable with the turbocharger unit on it. But that makes sense. That's how things work in real life. So there you go. With the turbocharger, and again, I'm pretty inexperienced with turbochargers. So if there's something that I didn't explain as well, or if maybe you think that there's a better way I could have set up this compressor, go ahead and leave that stuff in comments. I learn by doing just as much as anybody else. So let's go ahead and move along. So I switched this thing up to a 4-barrel carburetor, and again, the more fuel octane I have to work with, the better. Now I still kept it with regular fuel. And I could have changed it to premium fuel, and maybe that would have made sense. But again, we're keeping things economical here. And then I went with a performance intake. Obviously that gives us a little bit more power and everything. So that's good as far as I'm concerned. And as I said, regular fuel type. Now, one thing I could do here, and I would do if, well, let's see. This is one option I could have. Go to premium fuel and then lower that fuel mixture. Now, we're going to lose power by doing this, but we're going to gain in economy because one thing that this engine really suffers in is economy. So I would put the engine somewhere around like this, and we would lose, 4 horsepower. But in the end, we'd gain a lot of economy out of that. And let's see where we are percentage-wise. So just to show you the way that the engine was set up before, and I think it was at something like 14.5. We can see here in a second. It was less than that. It was 14.1, wasn't it? Yeah, it was at 14.1. Well, now let's see what the economy numbers are. So we get the power. Well, let's see where economy numbers are. We see we're at 12.79%. So we gain quite a lot in economy by doing that switch. And, I might actually consider that. But it was 4 horsepower, huh? 140 horsepower is kind of where I want to see things. I would have liked to see a better benefit than what we ended up with. But 40 horsepower is not anything to laugh at, especially considering how much smaller in displacement we were. But I'm kind of concerned about the economy there. With 12%, I'm going to assume that economy is going to be pretty bad. But we'll have to see. I mean, that's one of the things that we can mess with when we do the car build, and I can tweak this engine when we get to that if the economy numbers don't look right. Any case, exhaust, you're pretty much forced to use a short cast, which is going to limit us. We're, essentially the max power it allows through is 140. Now, obviously, you can get higher than that, as we did. But, that restriction is going to, affect us more and more. I don't know how realistic that is to be limited like that with your headers with a turbocharged system like this, but that's the way that the game does it. I ended up having to go up with the exhaust diameter as well, up to 2 inches, gives us the best result. Oh, did I also talk about the RPM limit? So we're up to 6,900 RPM with the RPM limit there, which is pretty much where our peak performance index was. So pretty good there. And I downgraded this thing to be just a single reverse flow muffler, just like what we had on our other engine. So that is pretty much more or less the same. And there you have it. So let's go ahead and look at the numbers and compare them here. So the main thing we're going to want to be looking at is the L135 engine with our high output variant and our turbocharged, and I put I for intercooler, so turbocharged intercooler version. So as we can see here, 100 horsepower versus 140.6. When you're in the engine builder there, it does a little bit of creative rounding with the horsepower numbers. When you come out here, you actually get the exact numbers. Now, torque, we didn't benefit as much, and a lot of that is how aggressively I set up the cam profile and a lot of the other setup choices that I made. So We only gained a little bit in torque there, which is okay in some ways because what does this game hate? It hates torque. Torque equals wheel spin. Wheel spin is bad. So, in some ways we might benefit from that. As far as the emissions, we're definitely worse. And honestly, that's not too surprising, I guess. Responsiveness, we're not too responsive. And you know what? I think that might be a big difference. Comparatively, we're not as responsive. And I think that might be, but we're more responsive than our other 1.6 liter engine. So that's interesting to see. But I think some of that also might be, your turbocharger is going to make it, a little bit less responsive because you still have the spool up time. You're going to have that turbo lag, no matter what you do. I tried to mitigate that by making the turbine smaller, but we're still going to have a little bit of that spool up time. Loudness, it's less loud, which we could even go with a straight through pipe maybe, as far as that's concerned, but it's not that big of a difference. Smoothness, it's a lot smoother, which is interesting, but not too surprising. Smaller displacement, things like that. Production time, now we're seeing that it's actually excuse me. It takes longer to build, but it is still less expensive, even though I went with a lot of those options that I went with a, the piston, the crank, the conrod, as well as the turbocharging system itself and the intercooler. And reliability-wise is where we see a big difference. The base engine was at 54, and we're all the way down to 43. And it is also less reliable than our 2.2 high output by a good 4 points. So that's one detriment to this engine as well. And the other detriment we already talked about, which is that economy. So going down to less than 13% versus what we could get it up to as high as 14.5%. I think that gets us a little bit more in the ballpark of the percentage numbers that we're getting from our other engines. And you also have to consider that this engine is heavier with that intercooler and the turbocharging system and everything. It is heavier. This is aluminum, obviously, so that's one of the reasons why. But it is heavier than our other engine, so that's going to be even more of a detriment to our fuel economy. So that is one thing to consider. So as I said, I could do that tweak when we actually get into the car builder, dropping down that power in exchange for economy if the economy numbers are really terrible. But that's one of those things we're just going to have to see when it comes. In any case, I hope you guys have enjoyed this video. This is Mouse Gunner, signing out.